This week, we saw the Supreme Court have oral arguments on whether or not taxpayer money will fund religious schools. But that was not even the worst of it. We heard Stephen Miller talk about their grand plans for funding education. We heard Elon Musk on X talk about the birth rate. As we know, Republicans are making it harder for women to register to vote with the SAVE Act. And across the board in their anti-DEI policies, they have eliminated women. My name is Dina Doll with the MeidasTouch Network. Let's break this down. Now, all of these are part of the Project 2025 mission of making this country a Christian nationalist white male country. And they're doing it piece by piece, and they're doing it with a whole bunch of other really bad policies. So sometimes this can get lost in translation, let's say. So let's first focus on the Supreme Court case. The idea that the Supreme Court in 2025 is even asking the question of whether or not your taxpayer dollars should fund a Catholic private school shows how far down we have gone in terms of their attempt to turn this country into a Christian nationalist country. Here's the setup. It's actually about Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, and this strange attempt actually was to defend the idea that their state shouldn't pay religious private schools. And then we have the religious Catholic school on the other side. And the Supreme Court justices, the typical ones that we've seen, Justice Amy Coney Barrett recused herself. So we have the four, and then we have the three liberal justices, and we'll see where Chief Justice Roberts ends up. But the question that they were evidently grappling with was whether or not charter schools are public or private. As you know, charter schools are publicly funded 100% by taxpayer money. And the religious Catholic school was trying to argue that they cannot be seen as public because the board that governs them have private officials on them and not public officials. And because of that, they are being discriminated against by not being allowed the benefit of the public funding. Justice Kagan made a really good point in her argument. She said, well, that we have majoritarian religions and minoritarian religions, let's say, and maybe the Catholic is a majority. But if you go down this road, you're going to have to also fund maybe more extreme religions that you wouldn't want to do. And if they decide they don't want to teach things in their curriculum, let's say about maybe not mixing men and women or, evolution, you're going to end up having to have taxpayer money fund this. So this was the argument, whether or not funding these religious schools is a violation of their free exercise, or if funding them was a violation of the anti-establishment clause of the First Amendment, because our Constitution, in terms of religion, has those two clauses that are often in tension. You don't want to restrict somebody's freedom to exercise the religion, and on the other hand, you don't want the government to establish religion. It looked like, based on that opinion, that the Supreme Court is going to say that the government has to fund these public religious schools in Oklahoma, and maybe the only way for some states to get around it is to have public officials on that board. But this is where we're at in 2025, and this is not an accident. It's not an accident because the Heritage Fund has been putting up judges for years in order to get to this point. This is a long game they are playing. And with the Supreme Court justices, majority Christian nationalist point of view, Chief Justice Roberts has tilted the Supreme Court over this past decade to take more and more pro-Christian opinions. And at the same time, we have Stephen Miller out there talking about, by abolishing the Department of Education, how they are going to send funds to local schools. Take a listen.
Children will be taught to love America. Children will be taught to be patriots. Children will be taught civic values for schools that want federal taxpayer funding. So as we close the Department of Education and we provide funding to states, we are going to make sure that these funds are not being used to promote communist ideology. For any nation to be successful, it cannot teach its children to hate themselves and to hate their country. So these are a few of the areas in which President Trump has fought the cancerous, communist, woke culture that was destroying this country, where we were led to believe that men were women, that women were men, that racial discrimination was good, that merit was bad, and that safety and physical security mattered less than the feelings of liberal ideologues.
When Stephen Miller talks about schools teaching men to be women and women to be men, that is not true. Schools are perhaps one of the most watched and regulated entities in our country. If schools were truly doing that, parents would be suing the schools right and left. It is not happening. When Stephen Miller is talking, though, about this, he is talking about pushing the Christian nationalist white male doctrine onto these local schools, withholding their funding unless they are willing to teach this point of view. First of all, we see this with the Supreme Court case that just happened, literally wanting to use taxpayer money to fund private schools. And now we're talking about, and from him, using federal money to advance their Project 2025 agenda. We see this not just with schools, but elsewhere in their anti-DEI policy, eliminating references to women because that is too diverse. They are trying to remove women from the conversation, and they're also trying to remove women from the right to vote. The SAVE Act, as we know, makes it more difficult for women to register to vote because our birth certificates are often different than our driver's license because we were married and changed our names. And the argument that somehow the real ID alleviates that problem is not true, because that bill that they passed, the House, specifically says that the real ID does not alleviate that issue. So they're literally making it harder for women to vote at the same time as they are trying to remove references to women across the board, at the same time as they're trying to oversee what schools teach about gender. And then we have Elon Musk on X talking about the birth rate being a problem. We see what J.D. Vance said on the campaign trail about shaming women who decided not to have children. If you think this and then the Dobbs decision, who of course took away women's right to choose, is a coincidence, it is not. This is the long game that the Heritage Foundation, the Project 2025, the Christian white nationalist movement is going toward, because they are not just looking for more people in this country. It is true that our country has a declining birth rate. And it is true that a declining birth rate is bad for the economy, because as people retire, there are less younger people to take the jobs. And that shrinks a country's overall GDP. That is happening in places like Japan. But here, we usually don't have that problem because people want to immigrate here from all over the world. So even if our birth rate decline, if our immigration rate, say, steady or increases, we have enough people to fill those jobs. But here we see Trump and MAGA wanting to stop immigrants from coming because they don't like brown and black people immigrating here, and they want the people here instead to have more babies. If your problem was just, increasing our GDP, increasing our economy, you would allow in immigrants. But that's not what you want. You want instead women here to have more children. And you have just told us the problem is women don't want to have more kids. Make no mistake, these are not all a coincidence. The Supreme Court is not deciding to give public funding to schools that celebrate the idea that women should be having babies in a vacuum. No, they're doing it at the same time as the federal government wants to control how schools talk about gender. At the same time that Congress wants to make it harder for women to vote. And at the same time, the richest man in the world that has the ear of Trump is talking about how we need more babies. The new season of Handmaid's Tale is out, and that used to be a more enjoyable show, but now it feels a little bit more like fact than fiction. My name is Dina Doll with the MeidasTouch Network. We won't forget any of these important issues. Free subscribe so you get the latest analysis of all the developments.
Love this video? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch and help us blow past 1 million followers.